Okay. Any questions before we pick up with the text? All right. So we were in chapter 13. We finished verse 22 last time, at least as I recall it. But let's just look through verse 22 again quickly and then move on to 23. In verse 22 he says, "Spirit seated in matter indeed experiences the qualities born of Prakriti. Attachment to the qualities is the cause of its birth in good and evil wombs." So he touches on this again in a few verses' time, but he is essentially giving here the definition of a living being, of a conscious being. He says, Purusha seated in Prakriti experiences the gunas. The gunas are born of Prakriti. So Prakriti is matter, or another way we've described it as nature. All of nature, all of matter has qualities. And when that nature is imbued with or impregnated with spirit, what arises is the conscious being. And that conscious being experiences the qualities of that matter. So we are experiencing the qualities of our own nature. So the example that he gives in the analogy, I should say, that he gives in chapter 7, he has a picture of a glass prism, and you have the unconditioned consciousness, the spirit, the Purusha coming in, and the prism is designated as Tamas, Rajas, and Sattva, the three gunas. The incoming light coming into that prism is refracted, and it exits as the qualities of the world, the pluralistic world, which means our world, our pluralistic world of experience. So what are we experiencing? Or put it another way, actually, what is each one of us? Each one of us is that conditioned consciousness, that conditioned light that emerges from the glass prism. What are the qualities of that light determined by? They're determined by the glass prism, the Tamas, Rajas, and Sattva. So we are experiencing our own qualities. How are we able to do that? Because there is consciousness embedded in it. So this is what he says. And the attachment to the gunas is the cause of its birth in good and evil wombs. So we become attached to various aspects of our world. As we develop desires and attachments, what that is doing is creating a further store of what we call vasanas. Those vasanas are the unmanifest tendencies of our own temperament. So I look at my temperament versus these are the good qualities, these are the bad qualities, these are the indifferent qualities, etc. They all arise from a dormant state. So we often use the example. Right now, everyone's philosophy vasanas are expressing, no one's opera vasanas are expressing. There are no thoughts, feelings, or actions towards opera. And so that portion of our personality is completely dormant if we have it. Later on, when we're scouring the internet, we see an advertisement for the local opera, bang, those vasanas come forward. So the fact that we develop attachments means that we are developing further vasanas, and those vasanas necessarily will express as thoughts, desires, feelings, and actions. The problem is, of course, that at the end of life, so goes the theory, those vasanas don't get eradicated. The only thing that happens at the end of life is that the life force in the physical body disappears. And so those vasanas need another expression in order for their fulfillment. And so we take, according to the theory of reincarnation, a new birth, a new embodiment, a new environment for the satisfaction of those vasanas. And so death is often described as the point where the environment and the embodiment can no longer satisfy the vasanas, and so there is a transfer. In the same way that if you are hungry and you have powerful, strong thoughts and feelings towards food because you're so hungry, then the environment that you're currently in, you're at your workplace or you're at your wherever it happens to be, that won't satisfy you. At some point, it will drive you out, and you'll be driven out of that environment, and you'll be born into the restaurant. Same sort of idea. So there's 23. Sorry, that was 22. In 23, he continues. He says, the Supreme Purusha, spirit, in this body is thus said to be the witness, permitter, supporter, enjoyer, great Lord, and also the Supreme Self. So let's have a look through the first paragraph of the commentary, because he starts to explain exactly what this verse is trying to convey. He says, the verse describes the role of the self, Purusha, in an individual's life, how Atman relates to the variety of human activities. A human being can be more cruel and destructive than the most ferocious carnivore, or be most loving and sacrificial in the world. In this wide range of character and conduct, the verse covers the seemingly different roles that the Supreme Self plays. The Atman acts as an energizing force in all actions, from the sublime to the ridiculous. The following roles of Atman appear to change with actions in ascending order of superiority. So again, he uses these very important words here, appear to change. The verse covers the seemingly different roles that the Supreme Self plays. So again, we've got to remember that all of these descriptions are going to be, can be or should be understood as metaphor or simile or example, or, as we've often said, as poetry. The whole Bhagavad-Gita is a poem, so it's using these poetic devices to try and convey something which is very difficult to convey prosaically. So, what's he talking about here? As he says, the self is the fundamental cause of all action. Again, we often go back to chapter 3, verse 30. So this is in the chapter entitled Karma Yoga, the yoga of action. And he says, when we are engaging in Karma Yoga, what it means is that the body is engaging in dynamic activity, the mind has surrendered to the ideal, and the intellect recognizes the self as the source of all activity. So this is one of the ways that we often try to understand the self, is that from where do all of my activities arise? Okay, we can say, well, the activity arises from the body, but where does the body get that impulse, that compulsion from? It arises from my desires, which arises from my thoughts, which arises from my vasanas, etc. We go through this sort of analysis. Ultimately, what we get to when we delve into that question is one of two ways of putting it, is I don't know. I really don't know where my actions arise from. They start as just a single thought popping into my awareness, but even that, I don't know where it comes from. The other way to think about it is that when we look at our actions, they're all directed outward from an inner core, from an inner sense of self. Even that thought, where does it arise from? It arises from within me. So the idea of oneself as being the primary cause or the primary source of all activity is one of the ways that we often understand it. And so he takes that sort of idea and applies it to different degrees or different qualities of action. So as he says, the Atman acts as an energizing force in all actions, from the sublime to the ridiculous. The following roles of Atman appear to change with actions in ascending order of superiority. So of course the self does not change. It doesn't take on different roles. The idea here is that it's presenting sort of a poetic description of how the self functions. Perhaps another way you can think about it is to say, what's my relationship with myself during different types of activity, or while I am engaged at different levels of the personality. So he starts off with vicious actions, for example, and then he moves on to sacrificial actions, etc. So while I'm performing an action that is highly vicious and cruel, What's my relationship with myself? When I'm performing actions that are selfless and directed towards self-development, what's my relationship to myself then? So let's go through. The first one he says, Upadrashta, witness. He says the Supreme Self, Atman, acts as a mere witness to any vicious action, be it a petty offense or a serious crime. Atman no doubt supports all actions, yet Atman is not responsible for such an action, just as petrol is not responsible for bad driving or an accident that a car meets with. Atman, like petrol, behaves as an independent witness to any atrocity committed by an individual. So this is the first aspect of the self. And it's important to remember that all of these aspects are correct in a sense. None of them is correct entirely. So you sort of have to take all of these bits together and recognize that it's all of these. And of course, it's none of these. In the same way, when you look at the Kenopanishad, that first few verses, he says, it is the ear of the ear, it is the eye of the eye. So the essence of hearing and the essence of sight are the same thing. So now he's saying the same sort of idea. If you take all of these different aspects, they are all pointing towards the same thing. So that's why we often use the idea that none of these descriptions or definitions can be understood as descriptions or definitions. They rather need to be understood as pointers towards. And so again, with that idea of triangulating, if you know that it's from there and from there, then you take them both and you arrive at a single point. Same sort of thing. You take all of these different perspectives and they all seem to be pointing at something. So with regards to the idea of a witness, anytime we are performing an action that, he uses the term here, a vicious action, be it a petty offense or a serious crime. So the idea is that we would be functioning against our own conscience and conviction. We would be violating our obligations and caught up entirely in the material equipments and the ego. So when we function in this way, he says the self is a mere witness to it. So the word witness here is often misunderstood as I'm watching this. This is not the case. This is not what he means by witness in this regard. The word witness is often understood using the example of the sun. So you say the sun is a witness to all that happens. Now it doesn't mean that the sun is watching everything that happens. The sun being a witness to all that happens on the planet simply means that without the sun, what happens? All of life dies. But the sun is not affected or changed in any way by what happens. Good planet, bad planet, lots of good people, lots of bad people, self-destructive, self-fulfilling, whatever it happens to be. The sun is completely unaffected and it shines on the good and evil alike. This is the idea of witness. So it's not to be understood as a sort of I'm watching and understanding. So the idea of witness here simply means, again, that it is the self that supports all actions. The sun shines on good and bad alike. The self enlivens good and evil actions alike. But again, if you look at it from the perspective of how do I relate to myself when I'm performing an action which is a violation of my own obligations, one of the things that we can understand is that there is a complete lack of self-awareness. I was speaking to someone recently, and he's been in a number of positions where he's had to fire people. He's sort of been the boss. And he said to me once, I have never fired anyone for poor conduct. I've only fired people for lack of self-awareness. Perhaps what he means by that is to say that if you pull someone into your office and say, this behavior is unacceptable, and the person says, what are you talking about? Leave me alone, let me live my life, etc. Then you can say, okay, that guy's got no self-awareness. He doesn't recognize the effect his actions are having. There's no interest in introspecting and taking another person's perspective, etc. Total lack of self-awareness, total lack of empathy. The guy has to go. Whereas if the person had said, really, I hadn't thought of it that way. Let me look at this action again think about how it's affecting others. It shows self-awareness. That person, you'll give a chance. Okay, you give a written warning and you say, look, after this, there's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. I have to let you go. But when there is self-awareness, you give that person the benefit of the doubt that they can change. How does one's own self function when we are performing vicious actions? It's a mere witness. It supports the action. When we look back at an action like that that we have performed, we recognize that we were there. Of course I was there. In fact, we may even say to myself, how could I do that? Why do I keep doing this? Every time that person does this, I react in that way. Why do I keep doing it? So there's a recognition that I was there. I was the one performing it. In retrospect, I look at the action and I regret it. So there's a recognition that I was there the whole time, performing that action. Myself was present, but just as a mere witness, as a mere enlivener. Retrospectively, we can start to see this idea of a witness. So it's talking about actions for which we don't have a clear vision of the self. There's no clarity of the self. It's almost at its baseline functioning, sort of a live zero. The next one is anumanta, permitta. In a vicious action, the conscience pricks the mind. The mind becomes agitated and actions less productive. The human conscience acts as a deterrent in such an action. When, however, action turns righteous, the conscience no longer opposes it. Action then flows freely towards the desired objective. Atman appears to sanction and encourage the action, acts as a permitter. So, whether we know it or not, if we are performing a vicious action, the conscience will know it, as it were. The idea is that the conscience is often described as the voice of the subtle intellect. So we understand the intellect to be of two types, gross and subtle. The basic function of the intellect is the same. It's to discriminate. It recognizes a thing from what it is not. The gross intellect performs that function within the infinite pairs of opposites that make up our terrestrial world. The subtle intellect has only one area of discrimination. It is the terrestrial, with all of its various pairs of opposites, and not that, something which does not comprise pairs of opposites, i.e. the transcendental, consciousness, self, Atman, all these words are used. The idea is that the self is completely devoid of ego. There is an aspect of the personality which is utterly ego-free. There's no delusion as to its own identity. So the ego is our memory of who we are. What Vedanta says is that our current claim of identity and who and what we are is false. We are believing something to be true which is not true, which is often why it's also said that we need to clear the delusion or illusion. So there's an aspect of the personality which is utterly ego-free, not constrained by any of these wrong understandings. So the subtle intellect is that which posits this aspect of the personality, which is, using the language that we've just been discussing, Purusha, spirit, which is distinct and different from matter, which has qualities. Matter has qualities. Purusha does not have qualities. So the subtle intellect projects or posits this. So the voice of the subtle intellect then is anything which directs us towards that ego-free, quality-free sense of self or aspect of the personality. If it's directing us towards the self, it's pointing towards the self, then it must necessarily be pointing away from the ego. And so the voice of the subtle intellect then is that which shows us which action is self-centered, ego-centered, and which action is selfless, ego-less. So when we perform an action that is self-centered, the conscience says wrong direction. When we perform an action that is moving towards the self, capital S, just to be confusing. Then the ego says correct direction. So this is why we say, he says here, the human conscience acts as a deterrent in such an action. What kind of action is he talking about? A vicious action. So the word vicious refers to its egocentricity. It's ego-centered. A vicious action is not dictated by the activity itself or the effect on others. A vicious action is dictated by the intention underlying it. This is the context here. So a vicious action is one that is ego-centered. That pricks the mind. He says the conscience acts as a deterrent because we're going against the current of the mind. We're going against the current of the conscience, the direction of the conscience. So it's like a headwind. He says, on the other hand, when action turns righteous as opposed to vicious, righteous means exactly the opposite of vicious. That is directed away from the ego, towards the inner capital S self. That is in the same direction as the conscience. And so we are walking, as it were, with a tailwind. So any time that we are acting in a way that is in line with the conscience, how do we relate to that? What's our relationship to ourself when we are doing that? And first of all, we know that we are doing the right thing. There's a sense that we are moving in the right direction. So there's a greater clarity and self-awareness. Not only that, but there's more of a lightness to the activity. We're more free. In fact, we free up energy. What constrains us is the ego-centered activity. Our selfishness constrains our energies. The moment we start to act in a way that is unselfish, we'll feel that releasing of energy, the releasing of a constraint. So there's more of a bounce in the step, as it were. We go towards our activities and our obligations with alacrity, even if they're not something that appeal to our likes and dislikes in the way that we would prefer. So he says, when the action turns righteous, the conscience no longer opposes it, the action flows freely towards the desired action. So I think we used this example last time, or I used it somewhere recently. The idea is you take a child who comes home from school, right, say 14, 15 years old, walks into the house, throws his bag down, sits in front of Netflix and just watches a TV show or watches a movie, knowing full well that there is a geography test tomorrow to study for. And do it later. Finishes watching the movie, gets up at 8 p.m. and starts studying. Okay, he finishes studying, goes to school, does the exam, fine. But now you look at a different scenario. The boy comes home, throws his bag down, looks at it and recognizes, my geography book's in there, I've got that test tomorrow to study for. But I really want to see the latest episode of my favorite show. I'll do it. I'll watch it later. Takes the book, sits down, studies. Goes thoroughly through that chapter, makes his notes, etc. Closes the book, then goes to watch the Netflix film. What is the quality of enjoyment of the Netflix film in the second scenario? It's not the same. Even though the individual preference for that particular film is the same, the qualities of the film are the same, they are resonating with the same qualities, the same prakriti within the inner personality, and so that enjoyment is the same. But there's something added in the second scenario which is not present in the first. In the first scenario, there is that recognition, I have an obligation that is hanging over my head that needs to get done. The fact that I'm watching this means that I'm not doing something that I know I'm going to have to do. In the second scenario, when my obligations are completed, I've got nothing else to do, nothing else to study for, there is a new dimension of enjoyment that has been added. It's that conscience's recognition, this is an appropriate action. You've done all your obligations, it's okay to relax, this sort of idea. So how do we relate to ourselves when we are performing an action that is in line with the conscience? Our own personality supports it. And so when I sit down straight after school with my geography textbook and go through it. My own personality is supporting that activity. So myself appears, as it were, to support the activity. The next one is bhokta, enjoyer. As a seeker advances in spiritual development, as he approaches the self further, he not only fulfills his mission in life, he thoroughly enjoys himself doing whatever he does. A selfish person engaged in mundane action merely acquires material wealth, but never really gets to enjoy it. Whereas a spiritually evolved person always enjoys what he does and whatever he acquires. Atman appears to play the role of an enjoyer at that stage. So here, the idea is that there's a greater degree of satisfaction with the activity. The very fact that what we are doing is fulfilling our obligation, he says here, always enjoys what he does. The fact that we are fulfilling our obligations towards a spiritual goal gives us a sense of enjoyment. So again, you can go use that same sort of an example as a bit of an analogy here. I don't really want to sit and study my geography textbook. But once I've overcome that initial hump, that sort of activation energy to get me into the activity, what is the activity like? Okay, so think back to times where you've actually had to do this. When you actually start the study, when you start looking through their material, there is a sense of enjoyment that naturally comes with it, as long as it's basically within your nature, of course. Why? Because you're doing what you know you ought to do. So even when it's not something that conforms directly to your likes, I don't like studying much for exams. I don't like geography. It's kind of boring, but I have to take it. But nonetheless, I'm doing two things that don't conform to my likes. Studying when I'd rather be watching a film, and two, investigating a subject area that's not really my nature. Nonetheless, I can enjoy it. Where does that enjoyment come from? Well, one of the ways he talks about it here is the fact that I know I'm doing what I ought to be doing. He says, a selfish person engaged in mundane action merely acquires material wealth but never really gets to enjoy it. It's a really interesting idea. In the Ishavasya Upanishad, he says, by renunciation may you enjoy. The idea being that it's only by renunciation that we can gain enjoyment. How do you enjoy your wealth? You enjoy your wealth when you renounce it, when you give it up and spend it on something. It's only when you give up the wealth. Now imagine that you went to the local, let's stay with the example of opera, went to opera, and it was a $250 per seat because you're sitting in the front section or something. It's you and your friend, or you and your spouse, or you and your family, whatever it happens to be, and you look at the 4 seats that you spent just $1,000 on. And what do you experience? This is costing you $1,000. You can't enjoy a moment of that opera. Why? Because you have not renounced the money. You haven't given up the cash. You've handed it over. You've written a check or you've swiped your credit card. It's left your bank account, but you have not given it up. It's only when you actually give up the money, you surrender and say the money is gone. Whatever I think of the film, of the opera, whatever I think of the seats, whatever I think of everything else, the money's gone and I can't get it back. All right, fine, let it go. Then you can enjoy it. But the whole time, if I haven't renounced the money that I've just spent, I cannot enjoy the spending of it. I cannot enjoy the object that I have acquired. It's only by renunciation that we can enjoy anything, is what he says. So the spiritually evolved person has renounced everything, or is moving in that direction, we should say. As he says, as a seeker advances in spiritual development, he not only fulfills his mission in life, he thoroughly enjoys himself doing whatever he does. When I'm studying for my geography textbook, what have I renounced? the enjoyment of that film, or the enjoyment of anything that I could be doing in its place. I say, no, I'm here. I'm here now. I'm not doing anything else. For the next 2 hours, I'm just studying this chapter. That's it. The moment I renounce my time, my energy, my efforts as going towards anything which can satisfy my personal ego, there is a sense of enjoyment now. How do we get that sense of renunciation? Focusing on the higher ideal, the ultimate ideal being the self itself. So as the person grows spiritually, means as they become more attuned to the self within, then everything is renounced. In moment to moment, whatever else I could be doing, renounced, renounced, renounced. And so there's an enjoyment that arises from the activity. So this makes the activity righteous, is when we renounce our personal egocentric demands or preferences. He continues, he says, Maheshwara, great Lord. As a seeker approaches self nearest, he gains its supreme nature. He attains the power of self, becomes a tremendous force to reckon with, a monarch of all he surveys, a great Lord achieving and commanding the world. So one of the ways that we can sort of start to understand this is, again, what is it that gets in the way of achievement and command in the world? The thing that gets in the way of it primarily is our own ego. So a very simple way to understand this is the concept that Swamiji brings into The Fall of the Human Intellect, as well as the Governing Business and Relationships books, the 3 C's to success: concentration, consistency, and cooperation. If we're going to be successful in any endeavor, if we're going to achieve and command success in the world, he says you need to have concentration on the activity, because if you don't concentrate, then it means you can't perform the causes that need to go in to elicit the effect. If we're not concentrating, if our mind is distracted in other things, then we won't be able to put the causes in here in the present, so success is diminished. Consistency. If our mind is not under control, then we spend our time and our efforts in things that aren't directed towards the goals that we want to achieve. And finally, cooperation. The more selfish I am, the less I am able to empathize with others. If I can't empathize with others, then I don't consider their success, I don't consider their well-being to be important to me. There's a great line in the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King, and he talks about the fact that there are so many of our white brothers and sisters who joined us here today. They have recognized that their freedom is inextricably bound to our own. This is a great sort of idea that there's no such thing as one person's suffering, that there's an inextricable linkage of our own, of all of our freedoms. And so when I recognize that my freedom is inherently bound with your own, this idea is that I am seeing your well-being as being as important as my own well-being. So there's that harmony now. This is what he means by cooperation. Cooperation does not simply refer to people in the same project team working towards the same goal. That's an expression or manifestation of cooperation. Cooperation is our recognition that no one can achieve anything on their own. And when we have that, when we have as one of our goals other people's well-being, that is naturally reciprocated. So what gets in the way of me having your goal of well-being? My own ego, my selfishness. As long as I'm getting satisfied, I don't care what happens to you. So the moment we dissolve the ego more and more and more and more, what it means is that our actions take on more power. We are more consistent in the application of the causes that we want to achieve, and we naturally develop a sense of cooperation within the community. he attains the power of the self, becomes a tremendous force to reckon with. So it's not only these three aspects, but he'll know where to deploy his activities. This sort of comes a little bit under consistency, but the idea is there'll be hold back, hold back, hold back. There I deploy it. There I deploy the, not cash in as it were, but there I use my resources to achieve something. So the idea is that how does a person know this? How does a person know where to deploy and where not to? How does a person know what needs to be done and when? How does a person know what that person's needs are, and so on and so forth? It comes naturally. Again, what we are generally not aware of is the barrier to our clarity, to our harmony, to our empathy, and to our effectiveness in actions is our own selfishness. And go back to that very earlier example of performing a highly vicious or selfish action. Our own personality is not supporting it. We have to force our way through it against the direction of the conscience, walking into a headwind. That's limiting us. Take away that headwind. In fact, turn around and make it a tailwind. All of a sudden, life becomes so much easier. You gain the power of the self. It's a bit like you gain that tailwind. If you're running, a 10K run, and the whole way you've got a strong tailwind, you have gained the power of that wind. You're using it, and you're getting that result, which is to move swifter with less energy expenditure. Great Lord. And the final one, he says, Paramatma, Supreme Self. On complete identification with the self, the seed becomes one with the self, merges with Atman, Brahman becomes Brahman. Supreme Self. So this idea of a Supreme Self. The notion of supreme means at the top, cannot be surpassed. So perhaps one of the ways you can dig into this idea is to say that if there is a supreme self, a self that cannot be surpassed, then there is a self which is not supreme, which can be surpassed. In fact, maybe there's a multitude of selves that can be surpassed. This is sort of what he's talking about by supreme self, is that at the moment, I do have a sense of self. I have an identity. He says that identity can be transcended. You can rise above that identity into a higher identity. The way that he often puts it elsewhere in the texts is to say we rise or we grow into a higher dimension of knowledge. And so there's these ideas that we're growing into, we're transcending the lower level of identification and becoming a subtler personality. So in the Vedanta treatise and also in the book Thesis on God, we have this triangle. At the lowest, you have physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. These are the personalities, as it were. He refers to them as desires, but one of the things he says is that if I identify at the grossest level of my personality, I have maximum desires, physical desires, maximum demarcation and difference in the world. He says, as I identify with the subtler levels of my personality, I rise to become an emotional person now. I rise further, I become an intellectual. I rise further, I become a spiritual. Ultimately, the only personality I have is the one which is wanting to seek the supreme self. So there's a recognition that I have lifted myself above these other identities that I was claiming. At the time, I very much felt that that's who I was, in the same way that right now I feel that this body, mind, intellect is who I am. But now I recognize there is a higher identity waiting for me. It's sitting there, it's right there in my personality. All I have to do is contact it. How? Wading through, as he puts it in the VT. He says you've got to wade through the grosser elements of the personality, these personality layers towards the self. And it's done through thought. As you think, so you become. Wherever your thoughts alight, that we grow into. Ultimately, what happens is that the ego is completely abolished. The work of the conscience is finally over. It no longer has to keep pushing you in that direction. And we identify with the self, the supreme self. Means that we grow into our identity that is the truth, that is the reality. That is no longer something that can be superseded or transcended. I've heard it reported that Swamiji was once talking about the state of self-realization, and he said sadhana stops. In fact, he used it in the past tense. He was referring to himself, but he said sadhana stopped. That's it. The work is over, finished. The other analogy that, of course, we use a lot, and often we say this, the moment we try to understand what this means, complete identification with the self with a capital S. Anytime we try to understand this idea, go back to the same very powerful analogy and see if it works. Dreamer, waker. In the dreaming state of consciousness, you can have a multitude of selves, a multitude of identities, some better than others. In the first dream that I had, I was the criminal. In the second dream, I was the innocent victim. In the third dream, I was the police officer. In the fourth dream, I was, etc. An ascending character all the way along. Doesn't matter how good they are. They're great. They're fine. It's nice to have all these different personalities in the dream, but when you wake up, bang, all of those are transcended. It's supreme now with regards to the waker and dreamer. The dreamer is all of these false personalities. I am the waker. And while I'm here in the waking state, I'm never going to fall back and think to myself, I'm a criminal, I'm a victim, I'm a police officer. It never happens. You've reached that end point. You've transcended the whole illusion or delusion, as it were. Any questions before we move on to verse 24? Okay.
Could you repeat the concept that you just articulated?
The waker dreamer?
Well, yeah, and then what that led to.
So the idea is that in the dreaming state of consciousness, we might have 6 or 7 dreams in a night. We have a different range of persona, of personalities, of claims of who and what we are. None of these is supreme. They're all relative. They're all changing. When the dreamer leaves the dream, as it were, and enters the waking state of consciousness, the analogy is that all of those false identities have been left behind, and now I have transcended all of the dreaming consciousness personalities, and I have become this waker. This waker, by analogy, is what he's talking about as the supreme self. This is who I am. I'm not that criminal, not that victim, not that police officer, not that judge. I am me. I am Glenn, here in the waking state of consciousness. No more work needs to be done in order for me to recognize that truth. It's not that I need to continue to remind myself I am the waker. I'm not those dreaming personalities. I have done all the work. The analogy there is that here in the waking state of consciousness, we have a range of different personalities. A physical personality, I grow somewhat, become an emotional personality, I grow, I become an intellectual, and so on and so forth. What he's talking about here is that we continue to do work, continue to do sadhana, and we ascend those personalities. We become a better person. We look at our life when we were caught up in, say, the physical side of life purely. and recognize why would I function in that way? Well, obviously I did. I remember that I did that, but it seems crazy to me that I would have thought that that was a reasonable way to live my life. It's almost like it was a dream, that person. I know that he existed, but thank God he no longer does. You recognize you can see them as different personalities, but still this one also needs to be transcended. And so they continue to do the work. What he's saying is that at some point, when we become the Supreme Self, we achieve an identity which is unsurpassable. There's no higher sense of self. There's no higher claim of identity that we can make. The reality has been seen. So that's the analogy of going from the dreaming state of consciousness to the waking state of consciousness. You no longer have to do any work to remind yourself of who and what you are. You're there. And in the same way that the waker knows himself to be the waker, directly and intuitively, the self knows itself to be the self. There is that complete identification with the self. A seeker becomes one with the self. So there's no further sadhana, no further spiritual discipline being practiced.
Glenn, another question.
Mm.
Can you tie self-awareness the way you described it with the concept of regret?
So the idea of regret is that regret is the emotion that we feel when we have performed an action that goes against our conscience. Where does he say? In the paragraph under permitter, he says, in a vicious action, the conscience pricks the mind. So if I take a needle and prick your body feels uncomfortable. The conscience takes a needle and pricks the mind, and the mind feels uncomfortable. So regret is that uncomfortable emotion that we experience from having performed an action that goes against the conscience, that is ego-centered or self-centered. The question that... Yep.
In the past, we also talked about regret as being something where your intellect was not available at the time.
Yeah, so that's what I was getting to. So the reason that we would perform an action that goes against our own conscience and conviction is because, exactly as you said, the intellect is not available at the time of action. So when we talk about self-awareness, what does that mean? Self-awareness, or objectivity is another word that we often use, is to know what the mind is demanding and to have an assessment of which side of the fence it falls on. So go to that analogy again of the boy coming home and studying the geography textbook. There's the knowledge of what the mind is asking, go and watch Netflix. There is also the recognition of what my obligations are, a discrimination between these two things, and then a decision as to what the right thing to do is. The intellect is available at that time, so there's greater self-awareness. When we lack self-awareness, to some degree, the intellect will say, you've got that test to study for. The intellect may say, I should study for my test, but I want to watch Netflix. I'm going to watch Netflix. What that means is that the degree of self-awareness is less because you can't see what you ought to do. Yes, to an extent, you've been able to sort of have a dim vision of the surface, but there's no clarity. You haven't actually seen it. If you see what your obligation is, then you'll perform it. If you don't see it, you won't perform it. So even if I have the intelligence to say I should study my book before watching the film, that is not the seeing that we're referring to here. That's mere intelligence. It's just information. I have said film, book, I see that is my obligation, but it's intelligence, not intellect. So the intellect, when it sees, it has that insight. So self-awareness, objectivity, insight, in this context, they're also very much synonyms. If I lack self-awareness, I won't be able to see what my obligation is. Therefore, I won't perform it. Even if the intelligence does return to me and says, you ought to study the book, I don't bother listening to the intelligence. I don't see it as a truth. It's just information that has returned to me. And so this is, where that balance of, in terms of, ourselves, but also in terms of when we're guiding others, especially if it's parents and children, you've got that balance of putting external constraints on so that the intelligence is there. You ought to study before you watch films. But if you put too much constraint on, then what happens is that we take the focus off the insight that the child needs to develop. And so we put a whole range of constraints on and surveillances on the child, and all that he learns is, while I'm being watched, I have to act in this way. And when I'm not being watched, then I can do what I like. There's no insight into what the obligation is. So the only thing that really is going to work in giving our kids a moral compass is the development of the intellect, because it's the intellect which has the insight to recognize this is my obligation. And when we gain that insight, then we naturally perform it. But if all we're learning is at the level of intelligence, this is what they say I should do, and because I'm risking punishment or whatever, then I'll do it. That's all that we learn. It's only at the surface level. So regret arises because the intellect was not available to recognize what my obligation is. So this is the way that we can understand what self-awareness is. It's insight into our own personality, what's being demanded of me, and what my obligations are.
Just one more follow-up. Can you then expand that on when you talked about the employer and the employee being able to recognize their actions or not, which is of the past, and kind of be able to relate to what they did versus not as self-awareness? So
when you say it's in the past, when the employee is saying, gee, I hadn't thought about it that way, that's interesting. You bringing up something which is I'm unaware of. I didn't realize that behavior was going to be so disturbing. It might be referring to something in the past, but where is his self-awareness? It's here in the present moment. It's a retrospective analysis, but in that moment, he is recognizing the demands of his own mind, and now he's reflecting upon whether or not this may have been going against what he ought to have done because of the way that it is impacting others, and so on and so forth. So the self-awareness is with reference to a past activity. That's the subject under discussion, but self-awareness is his ability to have that insight that, okay, my mind was asking me for something. I need to balance this against what I think my obligations are. And this is new information now that is coming to me, which allows me to do that. So again, it's very much the same sort of idea. The self-awareness is, again, it's not the conclusion you arrive at. It's the state of having an introverted direction of attention so that you can gain insight. And so when the employer sees that behavior, as long as she is convinced that he's sincere and not just playing the role, then she'll see, aha, I can see that he is looking within himself, assessing his own demands, balancing that against what he thinks his obligations are. Now he's bringing in this new information to try and consider what his obligations are. There is self-awareness. At some point, if he's sincere, he will gain further insight as to what his obligations are and then function in this way, and so on and so forth.
Thanks.
So let's just quickly cover verse 24. He says, he who knows Purusha, spirit, and Prakriti, matter, together with the gunas, qualities, though living in whatever way, he is not born again. So he says, he who knows spirit and matter together with the qualities, that person is not born again. So the reason that we are born again, we touched on this when we were just talking about verse 22. The reason that we are continually born environment to environment to environment is because we have a demand. After this, I'm born into the kitchen to make breakfast. After that, I'm born into the shopping center to buy my groceries, etc., etc., etc. I have a demand that propels me into an environment. We take that idea and simply extend it across lifetimes. At the end of this lifetime, body falls away, but I still have demands. So I'm born into a new environment to fulfill those. He says, there is a certain condition in which we are not born again. So at the moment, let's say I'm a cigarette smoker. After this class, an hour and 15 minutes without a cigarette, that's a long time. Bang, I'm immediately born into the environment of having a cigarette. Once I have that wisdom, then I no longer am going to be propelled into the cigarette world. I'm totally out of it. I am not born again. Now, I give the example of my granddad. After he woke up from the hospital, from having the brain embolism, from that moment onwards, he was never again born into the cigarette world. He lived another 7 years, free from the cigarette world. Other worlds he was born into, of course, but we take that idea now and the same sort of thing. When we have completely cast off oparata, all desires of the mind. This is the description of a self-realized soul that he gives in chapter 2. When we have completely cast off all desires of the mind, then we are no longer born into a new environment because there's no demand that needs to be fulfilled. So what is that state? How does he describe it? He says, the one who knows spirit and matter together with the qualities, the gunas. That person is not born again. So who does that refer to? Well, that's clearly all of us. I can describe spirit, matter, and gunas. I just spent an hour and 15 minutes doing it. So good, no more birth for me. Job done. All right, clearly that's not the case. So it's not intelligence that has any impact. It is, again, insight or wisdom. So the example, again, what's the example that we should go back to here? Waker, dreamer. So when we look at that example, then what can you say? The one who knows the dreaming state of consciousness and the waking state of consciousness and how they relate, that person is awake. The dreamer cannot know the distinction between dreaming state, waking state, and how they relate. The dreamer is totally blacked out as far as that goes. I've used that example from the film Inception. It's basically a job interview, and or the training, and they take the new recruit into a dream, and they're sitting at a cafe talking to her, and they say to her, is this a dream or is this real? And she says, what are you talking about? This is our training. This is obviously real. And they say to her, well, how did you get here? And she looks around and suddenly realizes, I don't know. That's the whole conceit, that she's in the dream and doesn't know it. When we are in the dream, we have no capacity to know that we are in the dream and not the waking state of consciousness. Only the waker has that insight. So too, who is it that knows the distinction between spirit, matter, and how that becomes the individual, the one who is enjoying the qualities referred to in verse 22, the person who is self-realized. When we are self-realized, we are no longer born again. There are no demands any further. So let's just read the second paragraph of this commentary, because he describes this idea. He says, though living in whatever way. So let's explain this little phrase. He says, a self-realized person ends his cycle of birth and death. Having exhausted his vasanas, he will not be born again. Unfulfilled vasanas, desires, are the cause for reincarnation. On self-realization, all vasanas become exhausted except the prarabdha vasanas he is born with. Prarabdha vasanas are exhausted only through actual experience. A self-realized person carries these vasanas through his life until they are consumed through personal experience. When prarabdha vasanas are consumed, he dies. Attains mahasamadhi, the ultimate liberation. In the period of life between realization and death, an enlightened person lives according to his original prarabdha vasanas. That explains why they act differently in their lives after attaining realization. The verse indicates this phenomenon by stating that they live in different ways. So a good paragraph for reflection. The idea is that we are each born with a set of prarabdha vasanas. Those are those vasanas that demanded the most immediate expression. So where are you going to be born next? Well, it depends what the most pressing demand is. If you haven't had breakfast yet, perhaps the most pressing demand is breakfast. And so bang, be born into breakfast. What happens is that when we are born into this particular environment, reincarnated, theory says that what determines that are the prarabdha vasanas. So they have been generated, or they have generated this particular embodiment, and they continue to express until they have been exhausted. When they are exhausted, the next set of most powerful demands is given an expression. So the self-realized soul has completely eradicated all of those vasanas except for the prarabdha. What they say is that prarabdha vasanas cannot be dealt with. You can't add to them, you can't remove them. They just have to go through personal experience. The beautiful analogy in the Mundaka Upanishad. You have a fire with a log on it. That one log comprises the total fuel. And you'll find a little piece of wood gets heated up and it gets ejected. It cracks, the wood cracks and it ejects a spark. So you've got a tiny little piece of wood, an ember, flaming in an arc. And in those 3 or 4 seconds from the bulk of the wood, it arcs towards the ground, and before it even hits the ground, that fuel has been burnt up. You see the bright ember go from bright red to deep red to dark red to black, and then the ember falls to the ground. But you've still got the rest of the log, and so you've got another one and another one and another one, and it keeps on going. What he says is that while we are on this little arc, having ejected ourselves, we have the capacity to burn up the rest of the log with knowledge. He says that is the state of liberation, because we've completely transcended our false limited identification. All that needs to happen is that last little bit that was ejected needs to burn out. He says the state of self-realization is that ultimate state of liberation, and it can be experienced, it can be achieved before death. There is another school of thought which claims that self-realization cannot be achieved in one's lifetime. It's only achieved at the end of life, when the prarabdha vasanas are exhausted. Either way, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change our sadhana. Just get there and then we'll know which one is the truth. But the idea here is that each self-realized soul is simply living out the remainder of those prarabdha vasanas. And so this is why you get self-realized souls living in different ways, because the immediate demands that propelled that embodiment are different from person to person. This one demanded a female birth, this one a male birth. This one a Western, this one an Eastern. This one rich, this one poor. This one highly erudite, a scholar, this one an illiterate gardener. Whatever it happens to be is irrelevant. The point is that once that self-realization has been gained, they will continue to live on only to exhaust the prarabdha vasanas. Okay, Any further questions before we conclude?
So, in that context, Prabhavasanas, like you just use those series of examples of types of people, rich person, gardener. Are those positions in life a function of Prabhavasanas, or you're just saying regardless of what station in life you are, you have the same kind of basic Prabhavasana?
Just ask the question again. I'm not sure if I grasped
Well, I
it.
guess I'm a little confused about Prabhavasanas. I thought they were kind of just the core vasanas that you have, like to sustain yourself and things like that. But can they also?
Yeah, that they will have that aspect. I mean, the physical body, the nature of the physical body is to sustain itself. So that's common for every living creature, plant, animal, or human. It wants to sustain its physical existence. That would be part of the prarabdha, you could say. But the notion of prarabdha really is only given to describe the different styles of life, living in whatever way, the different qualities of that particular individual. So he says an animal simply lives its life exhausting its prarabdha vasanas. So the vasanas for a cat, vasanas for a dog, they're different and distinct, but they're both prarabdha. So too, you have your prarabdha vasanas that are simply expressing through your personal experience. I mean, they are exhausted, the life ends. So it does refer to these different qualities of the individual, yes.
Could you just give a few examples of those kinds of qualities?
We wouldn't know. We've got no way of knowing which vasanas are prarabdha and which ones are not. We could make up analogies, but we'd never know what's truly a prarabdha vasana and what's not, because we don't know who's self-realized. But you take someone that you claim or you believe to be a self-realized soul, and you see that he plays cricket. Okay, then how can he be playing cricket if he's self-realized? Because he's got rid of all of his vasanas. They're prarabdha vasanas. So that must be part of the prarabdha if he's still playing cricket, because he's living in whatever way as a cricket player. Swami Ramatirtha, after self-realization, gave lectures and lectures and lectures. Ramana Maharishi, after self-realization, sat on his couch. He gave answers to questions, but basically he was, and living in a loincloth and serving the poor food and playing with animals. Swami Parthasarathy lives in nice surroundings and does lots of talking and traveling around the world. What marks the difference? These must all be prarabdha vasanas. If they are self-realized souls, then they are the prarabdha. The expression of traveling around the world and talking, or sitting in one ashram and never leaving in Tiruvannamalai, that's his prarabdha. That's his prarabdha. The Tyagaraja is a great singer, a composer of songs. That's his prarabdha vasanas. So we don't know you can't give examples of prarabdha vasanas. Whatever the life of the self-realized soul is, they must be prarabdha vasanas. So you look at yourself. If you were to be self-realized tomorrow, there'll be a bunch of perceptions, actions, emotions, and thoughts that express through your erstwhile personality. They are your prarabdha. And if you're not self-realized, they are still your prarabdha. The problem is that we don't know what's prarabdha and what's not. Now, broadly speaking, I mean, if you want to say, well, I'm going to be a male until I die, then fine. Yes, the male is the part of the prarabdha vasanas. But again, it's difficult to make this analysis. We've got to be very careful because we're skirting right on the edge of what we have the capabilities to understand. And so when we start analyzing in our areas of ignorance, we have to recognize this is mere speculation. And also recognize that whatever I do know about this, whatever I don't know about this, whatever is or isn't part of the vasanas, it does not change my practice. So by all means, there's nothing wrong with having an imaginative analysis in an area of ignorance. I mean, that's the fun part of philosophy. But don't pay it more value than it's worth. Because if it's not going to ultimately change the way that you practice, then it's just a method of inquiring into the unknown, but give it its due value and not more value than it should have. And this is a common trap that I think I've seen everyone in the academy fall into at one point or another, is to want to know more about the unknowable and give that desire more value than it's worth, because you can never know.
That seems like an appropriate way to end the class, telling us we can never know.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, take that with you for the rest of the week. It's unknowable, so relax. Don't bother getting caught up in knowing.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks, Len.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks.